Joining us again for OT Office Hours. I'm Sam Becker, the Director of Marketing here at Insane Cyber. At Insane Cyber, we're focused on combining host and network data analysis for a full picture of OT cybersecurity to detect, secure, and maintain resilience among an evolving threat landscape. Today, we're joined by our CEO and founder, Dan Gunter, Marissa Costa, and MacLeod Bracken, who are analysts from our services team. And they're going to be diving into living off the land attacks. For a quick housekeeping note, feel free to submit any questions through the Q&A function or the chat. We'll have some time at the end where the team will be answering any of those questions. They'll have an educational portion up front, and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. So we'll be sure to save some time for that. Other than that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them and let them get started.
Thanks so much, Sam. All right, welcome everyone to today's office hours. Please feel free to drop in and ask any questions. This is meant to be an educational forum. So yeah, let's chat. Today we're talking about abusing the everyday, a technical deep dive into living off the land attacks. So Dan, if you want to do a short little intro.
Yeah, no problem. As Sam mentioned, Dan Gunter, CEO and founder.
I'm Marissa. I am a senior cybersecurity analyst here at Insane Cyber. I started my career off as a reverse engineer, doing reversing of industrial proprietary protocols and building detections off of that. I then pivoted into industrial penetration testing that I've been doing since. I've done oil and gas, transportation, water treatment plants, you name it, always focused in operational technology.
And I'm MacLeod Bracken. I am a cybersecurity consultant here at Insane Cyber. I have a background in software engineering, and so a lot of the work I do is combining some of the software engineering skills that I have with the analytical skills that I've built up to try and automate analytical processes, and also to apply the engineering knowledge I have to helping clients secure their environment.
All right, so what is living off the land? So of course, let's start off with the definition, just in case anybody is not familiar with what living off the land is and what it means. When I tried to think about a way to tie this into everyday life and things that people might understand who aren't necessarily familiar with it, the term that came to mind was reduce, reuse, recycle, kind of, and I'll touch on that at the end of this slide. But for the technical definition, it's utilizing existing and legitimate tools on a target system to carry out malicious activities. So as a pen tester, I may be using and be familiar with things like Bloodhound and Sharphound and WinPeas and LinPeas and Mimikatz, but these are all tools that I bring into the system. They're in my toolkit, and if I can use them, great. But the problem is that those are very much detectable, and they may be flagged by the security team. So living off the land is the opposite of this. It's instead of introducing new and potentially detectable tools or malware, it's using tools that are already trusted by the system to blend in with normal activity and avoid detection. So for the reduce, reuse, recycle piece of it that I kind of thought of, it's reducing the amount of tools that I'm used to. So I'm specifically only using tools that are already on the system, that are native to the machine, that are trusted. And I'm reusing tools that the security team uses, the engineers and operators use, things that are already native to the system, and then recycling these. So if it's on one system, maybe I could guess that it's probably going to be on the next system that I pivot to. And we'll actually talk about a threat group today that everybody is probably familiar with that does this exact method, where they recycle the tools and the methods that they were doing in the environment that they were able to get a foothold in. So for living off the land, think of it as this coyote who's blending in. His coat is made for this. He's supposed to blend in with his surroundings so he can hunt his prey, instead of something like this, where it's very obvious that something sticks out here. It's that penguin that does not match its surroundings, and you can detect it. So why do you do living off the land? There are several different reasons why, one of them being environmental restrictions. So one of them could be you don't have any internet access. And honestly, if I'm on an operational technology pen test, internet access is the first thing that I check for. And if there is, it's actually something that I write up as a finding. There shouldn't be internet access at certain points in an environment. And so you're not going to be able to bring tools down that you normally would use. Another one is no removable media policies. This is also incredibly common depending on where you're at in the network or just in general, is that you can't just plug in a USB with your tools and bring them over. So no tool transfer. Also, it could be a specific ask. There are times where you may come across a customer who says, hey, I don't want you to use specific tools. I want to see what you can do, just how my environment is. Or they may be concerned that it's a sensitive environment and saying, hey, I don't have that much knowledge about my process, or maybe I do have a ton of knowledge about my process and my systems, and I know how sensitive it is. I don't want you to be bringing tools into my environment that are incredibly noisy, that can interact or impact, I should say, the process. And also, as a pen tester who's been in the industrial space, I make that call just as much as the teams do, is saying, hey, I know that where I am is particularly sensitive. Let me not use these tools that maybe are more common for an IT pen test. So those are some environmental factors. And then lastly, evading detection. This is a huge one and one of the major benefits or successes of living off the land. It's evading detection. The evasion can also be marked by this TTP here, which is system binary proxy execution. This is where adversaries can bypass processes or signature-based defenses by proxying execution of this malicious content with the signed or trusted binaries. These are often things like Microsoft signed files indicated that they've been downloaded from Microsoft or they're already on the host. Because the binaries are signed with these trusted digital certificates, they can typically execute on Windows systems. Several Microsoft signed binaries that are default on Windows installations can be used to proxy execution of other files or commands. So Aaron Boyd actually has a really great talk about this, about living off the land, and one of the things that he was able to do, where he was able to use bits admin to privilege escalate from an unprivileged user to a user with administrative privileges. Bits admin is a native Windows tool used to create, download, upload, schedule jobs, and it is Microsoft signed. So during one of his engagements, he observed that a target machine had a startup script running. However, only system and administrators privileges could modify that startup script. But he did notice that he could copy it, save it, and edit it locally. Bits admin runs in an elevated context because it's a trusted binary. And he was able to create a job with Bits admin and run that job that replaced the old startup script with the new one, which is where he had modified commands in there to add his user to the administrators group. All he had to do then was wait for an administrator to log on, and bam, the startup script executed, and his user now had admin privileges. No outside tools needed. So not only was this an ingenious way to get admin privileges, but it showed us how common it is for startup scripts to be in an environment, especially in OT. So I come across this very, very often where there's a specific OT vendor solution that they're using, and those just come prepackaged. Let me deploy it for you. There you go. And customers often do not do this kind of analysis where they're looking at startup scripts and who can modify them, who can make changes, but also what tools are on this machine already and how can that interact with this bigger picture. So yeah, in OT, this is really, really common for living off the land, these kinds of attacks. One other one that I came across once was BG Info. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with BG Info, but it's that software where when you log onto a machine on the desktop, it basically shows like the operating system, the host name, the IP address, kind of the system details that are just displayed right on the background. Well, I had noticed that on this machine, BG Info had what was essentially similar to a startup script. And in this instance, it wasn't protected. I could directly edit that startup script. And I did the same thing here where I just added two commands where I added my user and I added it to the administrators group. And there you go. I had administrative privileges. So really prevalent things here, especially in OT.
And another one, Marissa, there's also this capacity of like OT actually has some interesting use cases where living on the land can look really interesting in OT in specific areas like around gas turbine maintenance. And so a lot of OEMs have to do, annual or every so often maintenance, depending on the warranty window on gas turbines. And what's kind of interesting that we've seen in the past is both like on maintenance networks, right? So vendors have some access to the turbines, either for predictive maintenance, for other monitoring like that. Well, to Marissa's point, she was hitting earlier, some of punching holes in firewalls and just being like, hey, we'll trust GZGD or SDI protocol through, or we'll trust, Emerson or whoever else's protocol through. There can be interesting implications on the living on the land. The OEMs all handle it differently. Some will be like, hey, the maintenance part of the network, it's not BGP routable, so you can't reach it, but there's interesting living on the land opportunities, both from a like pure industrial protocol sense and quite frankly, a lot use PowerShell over it too. And so it's very common to see PowerShell tooling coming in and out on some of those links. And so, Marissa was mentioning some really good red teaming tools that you see commonly. The OEMs and the infrastructure around things, again, like turbine maintenance, like other areas like that, have like very required things that the engineers need to actually operate the plant, that are prime for kind of living on the land. So that's what I had, Marissa. I'll let you keep going.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is only maybe one or two pen tests in my experience where PowerShell was not available. So all of these native things you're typically going to see. I will now pass it off to MacLeod, where we're going to talk about the threat group that I mentioned earlier, who primarily used living off the land techniques.
Yep. So we're gonna talk a little bit about Volt Typhoon. I'm gonna give you guys just sort of a top level overview of who they were, what they did, and how they utilized living off the land techniques to fly under the radar in the environments that they managed to get into. So that in mind, I'll just start with the high level overview. May of 2023, Microsoft and several US federal agencies, including CISA, released a report on Volt Typhoon, which is a state-sponsored group from the People's Republic of China that was primarily noted for targeting critical infrastructure companies across the US and Guam since at least mid-2021, primarily hitting on companies in the energy sector, water, communications, and transportation sectors. And what was very interesting about this adversary group is that they managed to stay under the radar for at least months in each of the environments that they managed to get in. They heavily utilized living off the land techniques. They very infrequently utilized malware, oftentimes not using malware at all until they wanted to start enacting some C2 type behavior in these environments. And they'd be there for, like I said, months at a time, collecting information and sort of building out a profile of each of the victims that they tried to attack in order to make sure that they went undetected. So that said, I am going to go through each of the different tactics as per like the MITRE framework for tactics that they utilized in their primary workflow as they infiltrated each of these targets. But what should be noted that was very scary about Volt Typhoon as compared to other threat actors that we've seen is that they were very disciplined. They were very stealthy, and they were very strategic about how they approached each of the victims that they compromised. A lot of times when we've had threat actors compromise hosts in the past, they would try and act fast, and a lot of times they might get detected, but they would action faster than responders would be able to get them out of environments. But Volt Typhoon, on the other hand, once they got access, they didn't act fast. They, like we're saying, laid very low and stayed dormant for an extended period of time to collect a lot of information. So we can hop into our first tactic now, which is just the initial access, how they got in the environment. They did this a few different ways depending on the individual environment. In a lot of cases, they exploited vulnerabilities in public-facing network devices, primarily from Fortinet, Citrix, Cisco, Ivanti, Netgear, and others. But they would utilize publicly available exploits that were known on these devices, in addition to, in some cases, zero-day vulnerabilities that they had discovered and started exploiting themselves. What should be noted is that a lot of amateur threat actors would not normally have access to zero-day vulnerabilities, but given that Volt Typhoon was a nation state sponsored threat actor group, they did have those resources available to them to get into these environments a little bit easier than less funded threat actor groups might be able to. And then, yeah, they oftentimes liked to ingress traffic through compromised SOHO routers, so like the small office home network routers that you might have in smaller sort of distributed networks across like small offices or areas within your industrial network, to try and move laterally throughout a network once they got in. In a lot of cases, they would leverage credentials that they were able to steal, or dumps of credentials that they found online in order to get into these things. And that was kind of another thing that allowed them to get initial access to some of these environments, whereas they might have otherwise been stuck on the perimeter. And we'll get a little bit more into lateral movement more specifically later. But some of the most notable things about how they approached initial access is that they never were noted really to use malware. They often were actively trying to resemble what normal traffic would look like, which is a pattern that we'll see in pretty much all of the tactics that they executed on. A lot of times they tried to frame their traffic to look like legitimate VPN access, so like trying to log into VPN for the corporate network before trying to pivot into the OT network, depending on what and all they could get into at these individual companies. Kind of went case by case on what their initial access point was. They did a lot of detailed planning for each of these targets as they went in, a lot of showdown, a lot of FOFA before trying to get into these networks, which also helps them mimic what normal legitimate traffic would have looked like for a lot of these edge devices. That in mind, once they were in, we can talk a little bit about discovery. Or Dan, you have something to add?
Yeah, note on this, like something to look for in OT networks that we've seen is, again, going to like, whether it be that vendor maintenance where you're looking at, do people, are you on a joined AD network? So some plants are actually joined to their OEM, and a lot of plant managers don't know this because they haven't looked at traffic going in. And so, again, looking at links into plant is key. Looking at how remote access tools, RATs that are used kind of into plants, whether it be, proprietary or known, are huge. And just understanding sometimes this initial access, where it goes back to like even a default password issue can be, some vendors in some other areas put things like VNC on engineering workstations and other things. And those passwords have even been found out on Baidu and other places. So understanding your environment well, and again, those ingress and egress points, like it may, to MacLeod's point, it may come through, a firewall vuln, it may come through something to the living on the land theme that's actually authorized in your plant because it's part of how it operates. So MacLeod, I'll let you keep going.
Yeah, and actually I'm going to add on to that before we move to the next tactic, but sort of looping back to the SOHO routers on that. A lot of the time when those routers were targeted, it was because, especially in these distributed environments, those routers were not very well monitored. They were oftentimes underpatched, very reachable. They weren't well maintained on the perimeter at all, even though they're devices that would be sitting on the edge of your network and be totally accessible to the wild. But yeah, that in mind, once the attackers were able to get into these environments, they performed a variety of different reconnaissance techniques to sort of propagate out the information that they had on the networks of the victims that they compromised. And so what was interesting with this is they oftentimes would spend weeks, if not months, between running individual tools to avoid detection. And they only use tools that were native to the environment. They primarily used things like DS query, NL test, system info, like literally who am I, and net user queries. So things very much built into Windows, native Windows tools that are signed, not anything on, and are things that, you know, in a lot of cases at these plants, your IT department is going to be using them. Like it's not too odd to see these commands flying out every now and again. And so the fact that they were utilizing native commands in combination with the fact that they would stagger between uses of these commands to avoid detection made it very hard to determine what would be legitimate IT traffic versus traffic from an adversary without taking a closer look. So that in mind, they utilized these tools to enumerate a bunch of information on systems that they could find and identify within these environments, network services, groups and users, and would later go on to utilize that information to build out access maps on the credentials, which we'll talk about in the next tactic a little bit deeper. But all of this information served to furthering their ability to get access to more within these industrial environments. And it was that much harder to see them, just because everything that we're doing to get this information looked like legitimate traffic. But yeah, that in mind, a lot of what they targeted outside of the credentials included like installer update locations to identify software that was available, trust relationships between devices, in addition to the credentials information that we were already talking about. And so to get a little bit more into what exactly they did with those credentials, like I said, they mapped out a lot of what sort of the access maps looked like for the different credential sets that they were able to obtain were. And also as part of discovery, when they were able to get access to tools on certain devices, they in particularly on domain controllers, they would pull out the ntds.dit file and the system high file from these systems, and then take them offline. They'd exfiltrate them from whatever network they were in to decrypt the hashes corresponding to the credentials available in those files. And then they would leverage those credentials in combination with the access maps that they now had to log in and pivot throughout the systems and services available within a plant without, you know, flagging anything. They wouldn't be using the credentials in the wrong place because they had already sort of built out an access map of what could be used to get where. And so there were significantly fewer failed logon attempts and a lot more of what would look like standard normal traffic as they leverage these credentials to sort of move throughout these environments. They leveraged PowerShell a lot to leverage the credentials and sort of move along. They also used PowerShell to get event logs corresponding to what credentials were being used to log into by going through event logs. They also would use registry actually to look at some of what was being logged into and to look for credentials as well. And yeah, they were able to pivot around a lot just using credentials that they were able to obtain within the environment. And again, it goes back to that thing where they didn't have to use any dumping malware. There was no mimikatz. There was nothing else that they put into these environments to get the credentials back necessary for them to pivot around the victim environments. We can move into lateral movement, which those two kind of mesh together. Like I said, a lot of the lateral movement was by using valid credentials, but they also moved around through RDP shadowing and hijacking, which is something that Marissa is going to touch a little bit more on in a little bit on as far as specifics. But TSCon was something that was very popularly used by Volt Typhoon in a lot of their campaigns, and they were able to essentially hijack legitimate RDP sessions that were already going on within environments, and then leverage those hijacked sessions to continue moving throughout the environment. And so there were no logs for a new RDP session opening that shouldn't have been there, because it was an RDP session that was actually legitimate and was initially launched by a user or somebody native to the environment that was then hijacked by these attackers and used for malicious purposes. They also utilize PSExec and WMIC to remotely execute commands on systems that they were able to gain access to, either again through the valid credentials or through hijacking sessions of RDP. They were also able to get into admin shares and pivot through like file servers within these environments, again through the RDP and valid credentials that we've already been talking about. But yeah, a lot of the time their movement was very surgical and targeted, because they spent months ahead of time already doing reconnaissance in what they were interested in. And so they would go straight from whatever workstations they were able to get into a file server, then usually into DC, and then into an OT management software of some sort if they were able to get that far. And so it was a very surgical, very quick, okay, we've spent months doing reconnaissance. Now that we are going to action, we know exactly where we're going to go, because we've already propagated everything we need to know about these victim environments to move.
The other lateral movement note on this specific, like deep specific to OT, is realize that a lot of OT protocols do have file transfer built into the protocol stack, like DNP3 and others. And while I don't think there have been many open known abuses of OT protocol point to point, but like that's where looking at that function codes, like getting tools that can be like, hey, is someone using DNP3? Is someone else using, some OT native protocol that has file transfer, or, right, the classic OPCDA, right, which is really just COM, is someone registering COM interfaces and doing, stuff through COM. And so where living on the land can be dangerous, is that's where you also, from a lateral movement perspective, do need to go down to, newness or really having context on what's being sent. Because especially with those OT protocols, sometimes it's, white labeled or whitelisted through firewalls and such.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Sorry, before we move, I was going to say there's a couple questions in the chat before we move on. And sorry, MacLeod, I know you were going to speak, but
Sure.
First question is, did they bring along PSExec, or was it available already?
So PSExec is part of sysinternals, and from my understanding, a lot of cases it was already there. In cases that it wasn't already there, I would think that it wouldn't have been too much of an issue for them to bring it along, since again, it's part of that set of sysinternals that comes with Windows. And so if they moved it into the environment, it's not something that a lot of antiviruses or firewalls are going to be flagging by default. That said, I would think it would depend on the individual campaign that Volt Typhoon was doing. But talking a little bit more to this and just building off of what Dan had spoken to, I did want to add that one of the interesting things with not just industrial protocols, but also other legitimate services that you might be using to transfer files or information within your network that your firewalls would be authorizing is an attacker can totally masquerade as a lot of these services. They can use the same ports, they can use renamed executables, they can utilize a variety of techniques to make whatever transferring they're doing, be it C2 of some sort or just straight up exfiltration, look like legitimate services and industrial protocols that are present in your environment. So we can move into defense evasion a little bit. And so this is just defense evasion, persistence kind of go together. I just sort of am covering both here, but it's just talking to a lot of what we've already covered, that frequently what Volt Typhoon was doing was trying to utilize living off the land techniques. They weren't using external tools. They were using tools that were already there, tools that were either common to the environment and or Microsoft signed default tools, so that they wouldn't be picked up as anomalous among the other tools available. They did like using FRP in a couple of campaigns. They actually would obfuscate some of the client files for FRP and then utilize them to exfiltrate information. And I think they might have done C2 with it in one case, but that's something I would have to check. But again, it goes back to what we just sort of pivoted into, where they were masquerading as services that were already there, that were legitimate to the environment that they were in and wouldn't be flagged by the firewall, even though it was very much threat actor activity that was going on just in the name of these legitimate services. They stored a lot of the files that they outputted from both their reconnaissance and also any exfiltration that they were doing in just generic file names. They would sometimes store them in like user.dat or info.dat type file names, so that they just blended in with what you would think might generally be there. They weren't something that you would look at twice and think, oh, that shouldn't be there. They wouldn't name something exfil.dat. They tried to blend it in with what you might natively think would be on these systems. And then in a few of their campaigns, they would actually access the Windows event logs available in Active Directory or in domain controllers that they could get to, and they would selectively, not just completely wipe out logs, but they'd selectively clear out logs corresponding to activity that they were triggering in these environments to make it that much harder to notice that they were present. With that in mind, we can talk a little bit about C2. And this kind of the interesting thing with the tactics in general, and also as applied to the Volt Typhoon cases, there's a lot of intersection. So this is covering a little bit again of what we've sort of already talked about, but it was a lot of moving through Soho routers. Sometimes they would move through virtual private servers, just depending on what was available in the individual environments that they were working out of. But they would leverage these routers and VPSs to actually exfiltrate information, and also to set up reverse proxies for the purpose of C2 to command and control into victim environments. Some of that goes back to, again, setting up FRP clients that were very much not legitimate. They were compromised, and this is sort of some of what you would start to expect to trigger, but trigger like your EDS type solutions, or the IPS IDS solutions that you would have in your environment. But at this point, they had so much access and information on what was available and what was being covered that a lot of times it wouldn't trigger anything, because they were operating or routing traffic in a way that wouldn't cause anything to be set off. But once they got C2 channels up, they were able to move things out of the environment as they needed, or access whatever devices in these victim environments that they were interested in. Another interesting way, and this was more of a novel case out of what I found on the Volt Typhoon campaigns, but in one of these cases, they actually used Netish port proxy to modify registries directly corresponding to PRTG servers that were available in a victim environment to set up a reverse proxy through the PRTG server for the purpose of C2. And that was kind of an interesting one-off case that they were able to execute in one of these environments because of the amount of information that they collected over months before acting. We can move to the next slide, and we're gonna sort of go through these somewhat quick because we've already talked about it, but just sort of overall timeline. Initial access, after they got initial access, they would usually spend 4 to 9 months in the environment doing discovery and lateral and movement, just very slowly trying to mimic IT and legitimate traffic within these environments as best they could, and focused predominantly across all of their campaigns on credential harvesting, system info collection, and logon event tracking to build out access maps on what devices were there and what what credentials could get where, so that they could more easily pivot throughout these environments. And we can move on from here to
by scissor reporting. One note by scissor reporting, while it has the 4 to 9 months, some scissor reporting say in both typhoons 5+ years, just for awareness. So that dwell time can skew significantly. Again, USG sources are saying it's quite a long dwell time.
Yeah, it depended entirely on the victim. For the shorter term ones, it was 4 to 9 months, but 100%, yeah, for the longer term ones, it was years. And some of that, I think, from my understanding, is still estimated. They're not entirely sure how long Volt Typhoon was in some of these environments.
Yeah, I think there's one, and ease anyone on this call wondering where we're pulling from. There's one scissor report that's public, TLP clear, that has 5 years on it.
We can move on to mitigations, and we're just going to loosely overview these because we're going to dive a little bit more into just general living off the land mitigations later on. But just talking to Volt Typhoon directly, and what was learned from that is a lot of victims that were compromised relied very heavily on their perimeter. And if something made it over the perimeter, they stopped hunting for threats, which is not a good thing. But don't rely on your perimeter. Look at Windows event logs. Particularly, I have a couple of events that I picked out that would be good to look for what Volt Typhoon was generally doing in their campaign. But that said, you should look for things that are going to be native to your environment as well, that might be anomalous. And so that kind of will be case by case. Doing a lot of SIEM and host behavioral analysis is also good, looking for behavior that's anomalous compared to what you would normally expect out of your environment. And so sort of to go with that, baselining what legitimate activity should look like in your environment before allowing just sort of whatever to fly out is a good idea, so that when you do that behavioral analysis, what anomalous looks like, what shouldn't be occurring in your environment. And then just doing system hygiene audits, looking for public file drops, looking for trusted binaries being used in weird ways that aren't normal, are all good things to do to sort of help mitigate these living off the land issues. And so with that in mind, that's sort of our overview of Volt Typhoon, and I'm going to pass back to Marissa to talk more about just general living off the land.
Yeah, one thing I want to touch on while we're still on this mitigation slide here is one of the bullets here is system hygiene auditing. And I really wanted to call that one out because that one can be one that is particularly slept on in terms of a security strategy, but it is so important. So system hygiene review or system hygiene auditing is basically going through your assets and saying, why is this file here? Does it need to be here? Who's using it? How old is it? What is it for? Can we remove it so we don't just have things lying around? At least that's a piece of it, right? And I wanted to add a personal story about why this is so important. Is not only is this good for finding unusual files, I was once on an engagement where day 2 we had DA because a previous pen test team had left the extracted ntds.dit file on one of the machines we had access to that was most certainly not the domain controller. And the accounts in that file were still valid. So at the end of day 2, I had DA just because a file was left around. And if I can do that as a pen tester who's dropping on your network, most certainly can a threat group that is on your network. So system hygiene auditing, while it may be one of the simpler things you can do, it's very, very important. But yeah, so let's get into RDP hijacking, a personal favorite, which was a direct question. So I'm so happy somebody asked it. RDP hijacking with tscon.exe. This is a living off the land TTP that I always keep in my back pocket because of how sneaky it is, how easy it is, and how accessible it is. So what is tscon? It's a Windows command line tool used to connect or disconnect from an RDP session on a server. It's part of the remote desktop services, which is historically known as terminal services, and it allows users to connect from a different session on the same server, effectively switching between users or between sessions. So It's originally used for troubleshooting and maintenance at security teams, right? But doesn't that kind of sound like a really important and a really powerful tool? Well, it most certainly is. And what is living off the land if not abusing tools by using them the way they're actually intended? And another interesting fact about this one and why it flies a bit under the radar is that it doesn't trigger RDP logs. So to get into it a little bit more, what's the purpose if we're tying it to the MITRE ATT&CK framework? What kind of tactic is it? Technically classified as lateral movement or pivoting. And a great note here, in some ways that you can do this attack, you don't need a password. I will also note that depending on the user that you're targeting, depending on the sessions that are available to you, you may actually also end up privilege escalating. Which in this example I'm going to show was the case. So depending on the user and the session you're taking over, when you assume the rights of those users, you are acting under that user, you essentially can also privilege escalate, which is a nice little bonus for this TTP. There are some requirements I will call out. Number one is that you need system level access. So in my example, I have a local admin privilege to start. We're not going to get into, privilege escalating, but once you have local admin, a really great way to get system level access is using PSExec. It's essentially just PSExec, TAC-S, TAC-I, CMD, and it opens a shell that is running in system context. Another important note is that in my testing, it's only now working on Windows versions prior to Windows Server 2019. So I've had this successful all the way up to Windows Server 2016, but in Windows Server 2019, it seems to have failed. And I actually did some research to try to figure out what changed. Was this purposefully mitigated? What's going on here? And there's actually not a lot of information on why, so that's kind of interesting. But just know on some of the newer Windows Server versions that this technique isn't necessarily possible anymore. And then we will also need an active or disconnected RDP session of another user from the current host to another host. So active is essentially somebody who has an active RDP session, right? They're actively using it and working. If you target an active session, you will boot them off. So know that you're no longer flying under the radar. They're going to know that you're there. They're going to know that something's wrong. But when you see DISC, which stands for disconnected, and we'll show what the output looks like, this happens when a user closes an RDP session without fully logging off. So this is essentially called a hanging session where there's a lot of idle time and it's not fully disconnected. The user kind of just like closed the window, but they didn't fully log out and end the session. So we call that hanging sessions. All right, so I'm going to walk through the step-by-step process, and I think by the end of it, you guys are going to be like, wow, that seemed not so exciting and really easy. And yeah, it is really easy, which is why it makes it exciting to me. So the first thing that you're going to do in PowerShell or command line is run query user, and this identifies the RDP sessions that are on that server. So when you see console, where you can see it here where administrator is, that's essentially a local login. Sometimes you may see here RDP TAC TCP, that is indicative of a remote session. Some other things that will pop up here that are important to note is an ID here. This is the session ID. So administrator has session ID 1, and we have this user here named Bob who has session ID 2. We have our session states. So we have an active state and a disconnected state, which is great. I see an account with a disconnected state. That's particularly interesting to me. The idle time, that can be sometimes something really interesting. I've seen idle times of days, like days of a session being open and disconnected. So really interesting there. All right. So once you've identified a user or a session that's interesting, you can also do some recon on that user using local commands. So if I do net user Bob, TAC domain, I'm going to get this user's profile. And what's specifically interesting to me is what global group memberships is Bob in? And I can see here that Bob is a domain administrator, which is great. I definitely want to target this user. If I do RDP hijacking and it's successful, I'm essentially acting as Bob, who is a DA, and I can do a lot more things. So Once again, we've run query user. We know our sessions that are available to you. All I have to do with system privileges in mind, so this needs a shell that has system privs, which again, you can do with PSExec, which is really easy, is just run tscon and then the session ID. So if I want to be Bob, I just run tscon2 because that's his session ID. And what's going to happen is you're going to drop into his remote session, and now you can see the screen that he was looking at, the processes that he was using. You have his privileges, and you can do a quick check, just who am I, username, and I can see that I'm Bob, and now I'm on a laptop, or a server, I should say, called Jump Server 1. And that's really all there is to it for RDP hijacking with tscon.exe, and that's exactly some of the things that Volt Typhoon did during their campaign, and an attack that I always try to do if available to me on a pen test. So some mitigation and detection for this specific TTP. Number one, it's to educate your staff on fully disconnecting sessions. Cybersecurity education is really important for everybody in the company. And so to tell somebody, hey, if you're going to be using RDP, sorry if you guys can hear the sirens, if you're going to be using RDP for your typical workflow, make sure that you fully disconnect and log off the session so it's not just hanging. Next is set RDP session timeouts. This is also a great one. Let's say that we have forgetful staff. If you set an RDP session timeout, it's going to automatically close. So there is no chance that it's hanging around for an extended period of time. Another one, maybe not directly related to this TTP, but a really good practice, is to restrict local admins from the RDP group. Local admins are very obviously targeted, and restricting them from the RDP group is a great security practice. There's really no reason that a local admin account should be in the RDP group. So kind of removing them from that as part of your policy is a really strong practice. And some other things you can do on the host itself. Monitor the use of tscon, right? Look at logs that show it running as system specifically, really important. Also the same thing for PSExec is an important one. And then specific event IDs that we want to call out. So we have 4778, which is log on. We have the one associated with log off. And in those particular IDs, you can also associate the logon IP or ID to the username, so you know what's happening here. And then also, as MacLeod had called out earlier, we have 4688, which is process creation, which is a really another important event ID to pay attention to. So what both Volt Typhoon and the popularity of living off the land TTP stresses is that network monitoring just simply is not enough. As Volt Typhoon showed, they didn't work during off hours. Most of their recon was local to the machine with local tooling. Network discovery was using local tools, and they even mimicked typical user workflow by reviewing Windows event logs. And that's like, I hate calling it genius, right? Because it's a threat group who was doing bad things, but it's very, very smart way to get an understanding of how users are moving out the environment day to day so that they can mimic that. And this is also specifically relevant to OT environments when I'm talking about network monitoring not being enough. As we talked about before, they should be isolated from the internet, these OT devices, and restricting payload and tool transfer, or that's what happens when it's isolated from the internet, and often having removable media deny policies. So without some sort of host monitoring, a lot of this malicious activity is going to go unnoticed for a significant amount of time, like 9 months or 5 years. So network monitoring is not enough. Host monitoring is absolutely recommended for the fullest picture and the fastest detection. And I will just note on a personal level, this makes me really excited in the recent work that I've been doing with our partners, where we do incident response cases or indicator or compromise assessments for them. And the first thing that I'm running to is Windows event logs. And the next thing I do after that is create tickets for my engineers to develop our Windows event log ingestion and reporting capabilities so that these things are getting visibility in the platform and we're not just getting network monitoring, but we can look and collect and analyze both things together. And that is all I have today. So we can open it up for questions. Or I don't know if Dan, you wanted to jump in on the importance of host-based detections and getting the full visibility in OT.
No, I think you hit it pretty well. We'll hit some of the questions.
Yeah,
I'm sure we'll hit that.
yeah, we've got our first question is actually specific to OT. So the first question is it common or have you seen many OT environments that allow remote access tools, i.e. VNC, RDP, desktop anywhere, etc.?
Unfortunately.
Yeah, so the scary thing here is a lot don't realize that OEMs are actually using it again for some of that stack. And so this is where like a deep understanding, like if you're just doing an assessment in a certain part of the plant, you might actually miss the part of the plant that stuff's at. So some of this honestly is non-optional for OT, to where like even like OEMs or others drop it in, or it's part of the engineer managed solution. In other cases, people opt in, but like there are cases that it's a part of just how the plant's managed that are out of the box, I would say. Do you think that's fair, Marissa and MacLeod? Like I'm sure y'all have seen that too.
Yeah, I see RDP used significantly. Especially one time I did this RDP hijacking attack and it dropped me onto what essentially was an HMI. So operators and engineers love ease of use and we can't blame them, but I absolutely see this happening for sure.
Yeah.
We've had cases too where we've found it with an asset owner and then gone to an OEM and actually hardened infrastructure. So either ask the OEM to turn certain things off or do things like, hey, let's install sysinternals, some of the extended sysinternals logging so we get some of the deeper event logs to see stuff. But we have had when we found it, especially in this space where it was actually designed into the plant. We've had cases where we've been able to work with engineering and others to have workarounds, but again, a lot of the engineering side like also doesn't know. Like the cases we found it's funny, they'd be like, this is sold as a one-way thing, and it's like you're actually domain joined to your OEM in ways you didn't understand.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's not even just an OT. We have done some work in a data center environment where it's a lot of the same thing. In fact, even between sites, you would think that maybe we allow RDP within a site if you like proxy in or something. No, like there are cases where even between sites they'll just have it open that you could RDP between sites, and that's not ideal, but not uncommon.
And a note, if you are in like oil and gas and you do turnaround, it is fun when a plant's in turnaround and then suddenly you have a lot more people RDPing around the refinery, around the site when a turnaround's going on. And so of a note, some of this can change if you're in a turnaround or maintenance window versus like a real window or operational window.
Yeah.
I guess what are some considerations like as people are considering this IT and OT, how can they kind of bring both teams together to make sure that it's not just an IT problem or an OT problem for living off land attacks?
That's a great question. I think that one of the best ways to start getting teams to work together is tabletop exercises. It points out, in the event that something happens, what does our chain of command look like and what do our actions look like? And also, when you start to ask those questions as a team, as a company, as an organization, and you say, okay, well, we need to review the logs. And then somebody from the security team pipes up and says, well, we don't ingest log. We don't do that. Like, we don't have it. It really brings to light the kind of gaps that are in your security program as a company so that you can help realize, okay, this is what we need to improve on. And it's a more official way to do that, right? Because I totally understand how difficult it is to go to another team and say, hey, we need to start doing this. And the other team is like, yeah, we'll get to it. Sure. And then, next week you're back at square one because there was no ball rolling. So I think in terms of getting teams to work together, tabletop exercises provide like a paper proof of we need this. And everybody is responsible.
Yeah, that's more of like a actionable activity to sort of build on that. Another good thing to make sure your team's doing is if you have any retros or anything on actions that you're taking within your environment, as far as adjusting your security posture, or even just like adjusting tools or adjusting firewall rules within one side of your environment, it's good to talk to the other side of your environment. We have worked in environments where the corp side and OT side security have sort of mirrored their structure on how they approach security, but then they'll action on things separately. And there are learnings that have happened as they have worked to build out their security programs that are 100% things that can be applied to the other team. And they don't always talk about it. And so setting aside time to communicate some of those things can be really important.
Okay, great. We don't have any other questions in the chat, so I want to say thank you guys for joining and for the time. This was a really great session and really educational. So again, thank you guys for joining. And like I put in the chat, next month's session is with Ron Fabella, and we're going to be talking about modeling low impact ICS threat actor attacks with Dan and Ron. So again, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.